The day had died slowly over the high plains, leaving behind a burnt orange sky stretched wide across the horizon. The wind carried the faint scent of sagebrush and dust, whispering through the tall grass that surrounded the Thorne ranch. Inside the dim barn, Caleb Thorne finished brushing down his bay stallion. The giant of a man moved with deliberate quietness, slow, steady, and alone. Everyone in the nearby town of Clearwater Ridge knew him by name, but few by heart. The stories about him traveled faster than the wind. How he once broke a man's jaw for tormenting a horse, how he never set foot in church, how he buried his wife and son without saying a word. Some said the grief had made him cold. Others said he'd been born that way. Caleb didn't bother correcting either. Solitude was safer. It didn't cry, it didn't bleed, and it didn't leave you. The last sliver of sun was sinking behind the ridge when the peace of evening broke. A knock, sharp, frantic, desperate, echoed through the quiet ranch yard. Once, twice, 3 times. Caleb froze, his hand on the stall door. No one came to his ranch this late. The cattle dogs began barking, restless. Wiping his hands on a rag, he walked toward the house, boots crunching over gravel. The knocking came again, faster this time, mixed with a small voice crying. When he reached the porch, he hesitated just a moment. Then he pulled open the heavy door. There, beneath the flickering lantern light, stood a little girl, no taller than his waist. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks streaked with tears and grime. Her dress was torn at the hem, her tiny shoes caked with mud. She looked up at him, this mountain of a man, shadowed and silent, and didn't even flinch. Instead, she blurted between sobs, "They beat my mama! She's dying! Please, mister, you gotta help!" For a second, Caleb just stared, words caught somewhere in the back of his throat. The child's voice cracked, full of a terror that went straight through his chest like a knife. He finally crouched down to her level, his massive frame folding in half, his voice deep but gentle. "Easy now. Who's your mama, sweetheart?" The girl sniffled, rubbing her nose with the back of her hand. "Her name's Evelyn. She tried to run from them, but they hurt her bad. She can't move. Where is she?" Caleb asked, his tone firming. The girl turned and pointed toward the dark outline of the canyon beyond the fields. "By the creek. I ran all the way here. I didn't know where else to go." Caleb's stomach clenched. That creek lay nearly 2 miles off, in wild country where few dared to wander after sundown. His mind screamed to leave it be. He'd spent years avoiding the pain of other people's lives. But the sight of that trembling child, her lip quivering as she clutched a torn shawl, shattered every wall he'd built. He rose, towering above her, and said simply, "Stay close to me." Inside, he grabbed his lantern, his coat, and a rifle slung across his shoulder. The girl followed him silently, her small feet pattering against the wooden floor. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. He swung up onto his horse, then reached down and lifted the girl up before him. "Hold tight," he said. She wrapped her arms around his middle without hesitation. When he kicked the horse into motion, they cut through the night like a shadow in motion, hooves thundering against the hard earth, the lantern swinging wildly. Back in town, anyone who happened to glimpse the sight would later whisper in disbelief, Caleb Thorne, the silent, fearsome rancher who hadn't spoken to a soul in months, was riding into the dark, carrying a crying child toward danger. They'd wonder what could make such a man move so fast. Only one thing ever could, a call for help from someone too small to be heard otherwise. The moon had barely risen, a pale slice of silver behind drifting clouds, when Caleb Thorne's horse thundered across the open plains. The lantern hanging from his saddle threw wild shadows across the ground, lighting the little girl's frightened face as she clung to him. Her name, he'd learned between gasps of breath, was Lydia, 6 years old. Hungry, barefoot, and trembling against the chill of the wind, Caleb urged the horse faster. The hoofbeats echoed through the valley like the pounding of a giant heart. Every instinct in him, long buried under years of solitude, screamed that time was running out. The child had said her mother was dying, and in his experience, when a child used that word, it wasn't an exaggeration. Hold on tight, he rumbled again, glancing down. Lydia's small hands clutched at his coat with desperate strength. We'll find her, I promise. The promise surprised even him. Caleb had made few promises in life, and kept them all, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd given one so quickly, or to someone so small. They rode through the dark ravine, where the land dipped low and the wind carried the faint gurgle of running water. The air smelled of iron and damp earth. Caleb slowed the horse to a trot, scanning the ground by the faint lantern light. "Where, Lydia?" he asked. She pointed ahead with a trembling hand. "There by the rocks." She tried to hide from them. Caleb dismounted, boots sinking into the soft ground. He lifted Lydia down carefully and handed her the lantern. "Stay close. And don't look away from me." The girl nodded, eyes wide, as the light wavered over the jagged rocks and tall weeds. Then he saw her. A woman lay sprawled beside the creek, half hidden by brush. Her dress was torn, her arms streaked with bruises, one sleeve dark with blood. Caleb knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. "A pulse! Faint but there! Evelyn?" he said softly. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment they were filled with panic. She tried to crawl backward, mumbling, "Please, don't take her, please." "It's all right," Caleb said, his deep voice turning gentle. "You're safe now." "Your little girl found me." Lydia rushed to her mother's side, clutching her hand. "Mama, I brought help. The big man came. He's gonna fix everything." Tears gathered in the woman's eyes. She looked at Caleb then, really looked at him, and something like disbelief crossed her battered face. Perhaps she saw the size of him, the scars on his hands, the cold fire in his eyes, and wondered why a man like that would help a stranger like her. Caleb opened his coat, wrapping it around her shaking body. The night air bit through her thin dress. "You can't stay here," he said. "Can you stand?" She tried, but collapsed with a cry of pain. "My ribs, I can't." Without hesitation, Caleb lifted her into his arms. She was light as a shadow, her breath shallow against his chest. "We're going to my ranch," he said firmly. "You'll be safe there." Evelyn tried to protest. "You don't even know us. He'll come looking—" Caleb's voice cut through her fear, low and unyielding. "Let him." He turned to Lydia. "Climb up on the horse, sweetheart. Hold tight again." Once she was settled, he mounted behind her, cradling Evelyn carefully against his chest. The horse snorted, uneasy, sensing the tension. Caleb clicked his tongue softly, and they set off through the darkness again, the lantern swinging, casting fleeting glimpses of the mother's bruised face and the child's tear-streaked cheeks. The wind howled across the canyon as they rode back toward the ranch. Behind them, the night seemed to close in, heavy, silent, dangerous. Caleb's jaw clenched. Whoever had done this to a woman and child would have to reckon with him soon enough, for now, his only thought was to keep them alive until morning. And though he didn't know it yet, that single act of compassion, answering a little girl's desperate plea, was about to change the course of his life forever. The trail back to the ranch was long and silent. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of hooves and the faint groans of the injured woman in Caleb's arms. The lantern's glow swung with each stride, lighting the dust that rose in the horse's wake. Above them, the stars blinked faintly through a thick veil of clouds, and the air carried that heavy stillness that always came before a storm. Caleb Thorne had carried many burdens in his life, bales of hay, wounded cattle, even his wife's coffin, but never a living soul as fragile as this woman. Every jolt of the horse made her wince, and he tightened his hold unconsciously, trying to steady her. She smelled faintly of blood and lavender soap, an oddly human reminder of a world he'd long turned his back on. When the ranch finally came into view, the girl, Lydia, stirred from where she leaned sleepily against him. "We're home now?" she asked in a whisper. "For tonight," Caleb said quietly. He stopped before the porch, dismounted, and lifted Evelyn into his arms again. The woman was half-conscious, whispering something he couldn't quite catch. Only fragments. "Don't let him take her. Please don't let him—" Caleb's jaw tightened. Whoever he was, The fear in her voice was real and deep. Inside, the house was dark except for the dying fire in the hearth. Caleb laid her on the couch first, then fetched a lamp and lit it. The light revealed the extent of her injuries, bruises up her arms, a gash on her cheekbone, ribs likely broken. The sight made something twist inside him, a mix of anger and pity he hadn't felt in years. "Lydia," he said softly, "go fetch that blanket by the fire." The little girl obeyed instantly, her small hands trembling as she brought it over. Caleb draped it over Evelyn's shoulders, then poured water into a basin and began cleaning her wounds as best he could. His hands were rough, but his touch was careful. He wasn't used to gentleness, but something about this woman demanded it. After a while, she stirred again, blinking against the lamplight. Her voice came out in a rasp. Where am I?" "Thorn Ranch," he said. "You're safe now." Her eyes darted toward Lydia, who sat curled near the fire. "My little girl? She's all I have." "She's fine," Caleb assured her. "You've both been through enough for one night." Evelyn tried to sit up but gasped, clutching her side. "They'll come for me." "He always does." Caleb leaned forward, his voice steady but edged with steel. "Who?" Her eyes welled with tears. "My husband, Tom Bragg. He's a foreman at the mining camp near Clearwater. When he drinks, he turns into someone else. I ran when he said he'd sell Lydia to pay his debts. He found us by the creek. I thought I could hide." She trailed off, shaking her head as tears fell silently. Lydia crawled to her and held her mother's hand. Caleb sat back, silent. Rage simmered beneath his calm exterior. He'd seen men like Tom Bragg before, bullies who preyed on the weak, then hid behind the law or the bottle. He'd buried too many friends after such men. Finally, he spoke. "You'll stay here until you can walk again. No one's taking you or the girl from this ranch." Evelyn's eyes widened. "You'd risk that for strangers?" Caleb met her gaze steadily. "You're not strangers anymore." Outside, thunder rumbled low over the hills. Rain began to fall, pattering softly against the windows. The storm had finally come, but inside the cabin the fire burned brighter. For the first time in years, Caleb Thorne wasn't entirely alone, and for a woman half dead from cruelty, and a little girl with no home but her mother's arms. The giant rancher's house had become a sanctuary. They didn't know yet that this night, born from fear, pain, and kindness, would change all three of their lives forever. Morning came quietly to the Thorne Ranch. A thin mist clung to the ground, curling around the fences and drifting through the pastures like smoke. The sun crept over the ridge, spilling pale gold through the cracks of the shuttered windows. Inside the small cabin, the air smelled faintly of coffee and rain. Caleb Thorne sat at the edge of the table, elbows on his knees, his weathered hands clasped together. He hadn't slept. Every so often his eyes drifted toward the spare room where the injured woman, Evelyn Bragg, lay sleeping. The night had been long. She'd cried out several times in fevered half-dreams, mumbling about a man named Tom, about debts, and about running. Each time, Caleb had gone to the doorway, standing watch until her breathing steadied again. He'd seen suffering before, seen men torn apart in stampedes, seen women widowed by greed and violence, but something about this woman's pain unsettled him. It wasn't just her broken ribs or bruises. It was the quiet dignity she tried to hold on to even in ruin. She reminded him painfully of the strength his late wife once carried. In the kitchen, Lydia was perched on a stool too high for her little legs, swinging her feet as she watched Caleb with curious eyes. She had washed her face and combed her tangled hair as best she could. When he set a plate of biscuits before her, her eyes lit up like the sun finally breaking through cloud. "For me?" she asked softly. "For you," he said, pouring her milk from the jug. She whispered a small, "Thank you," then ate quickly as if afraid someone might take it away. Caleb said nothing, just watched in silence. The sound of the girl's small bites and the soft ticking of the clock filled the quiet house in a way that felt oddly comforting. When Evelyn finally stirred, her voice was weak. "Lydia?" she called. The little girl slid off the stool and ran into the room. Caleb followed, stopping at the doorway. Evelyn tried to sit up, wincing as she clutched her ribs. Her eyes darted toward him, hesitant, unsure. "I owe you my life," she said softly. "I don't know how to thank you." Caleb shook his head. "No thanks needed. You and the girl stay here until you're strong enough to stand again." Evelyn frowned. "I don't want to bring you trouble." "My husband. He's not the kind to let go. If he finds out, he won't touch you here," Caleb interrupted, his voice firm but calm. "You have my word." The weight of his tone left no room for argument. Even Evelyn seemed to understand that his promise meant more than words. It was a vow carved into the very bones of the man. The day passed quietly. Caleb went about his chores, though his mind wasn't on them. When he came in from the fields that evening, he found Evelyn sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale but peaceful. Lydia was at her feet, humming as she braided grass stems into little crowns. Caleb paused in the doorway, watching them for a long moment. Something inside him, a place long sealed shut, shifted. This porch had seen only silence for years. Now it held laughter, however faint, and warmth that wasn't from the sun. "You shouldn't be up yet," he said, stepping forward. "I needed fresh air," she replied, managing a small smile. "It's been a long time since I felt safe enough to breathe it." Caleb nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "You can breathe easy here." She looked up at him then, her eyes softening. "Why are you doing this for us, Mr. Thorne?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "Because once, someone helped me when I didn't deserve it either." As the sun dipped low, the ranch seemed to glow in the fading light. Lydia laughed as she placed a crooked grass crown on Caleb's head. And for the first time in years, the giant rancher let himself smile, a quiet, fleeting thing that carried the weight of hope. Inside that small, weathered cabin, something fragile and new had taken root. Trust. And for a man who'd buried all reason to hope, it was the most dangerous and most beautiful thing of all. 3 days passed quietly on the Thorne Ranch. The bruised woman began to heal. Color returned slowly to Evelyn's face, though her ribs still ached when she breathed. Her little girl, Lydia, followed Caleb everywhere, feeding the hens, carrying small pails of grain, and watching him repair fences as if he were some giant carved from legend. The ranch, that had been silent for years, now hummed with the faint sounds of life, a child's laughter, the clatter of dishes, a woman's soft humming drifting from the porch. But peace, as Caleb knew too well, never lasted long. By the 4th morning, the dogs began to bark. Caleb stepped out from the barn, the sun glinting off his hat brim. A dust cloud rose in the distance, hooves. Someone was riding hard up the long dirt road that cut through the valley. He narrowed his eyes. Visitors rarely came this far out, and when they did, it meant trouble. The rider pulled up at the gate, a man in a tan coat with a silver star pinned to his chest. Sheriff Harlan Reese. He was older now, with gray in his beard and the kind of eyes that had seen too many lies. Caleb's shoulders tensed. "Morning, Caleb," the sheriff called as he dismounted. "Morning," Caleb answered, his voice like gravel underfoot. Reese took off his hat, wiped the sweat from his brow, and glanced toward the cabin. "Heard you've got company out here." Caleb said nothing. Reese sighed. "Now, I'm not one for gossip, but word's out in town. A woman, Evelyn Bragg, and her little girl. They've been seen around your place. That true?" Caleb's jaw flexed. "Could be." "Her husband's been looking for her," the sheriff said, watching him closely. "Tom Bragg claims she ran off and stole his savings. Says he wants her brought back." Caleb's eyes hardened. "She ran off because he beat her half to death." Reese shifted uneasily. "That may be, but the law says—" "The law," Caleb interrupted, "wasn't there when she was bleeding in the dirt. The law didn't hear her little girl beg for help." His voice was low but carried enough force to silence the birds overhead. The sheriff looked down at the ground, scuffing his boot. He respected Caleb, always had, but he was bound by duty. "You know I can't ignore a complaint, Caleb. You're harboring another man's wife." Caleb took a step closer. The sheer size of him made the sheriff take half a step back. "I'm harboring a woman who nearly died. You tell Tom Bragg if he wants her back, he can come take her from me himself." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. You'd really cross that line? I already have, Caleb said flatly. A long silence hung between them. Wind swept through the grass, whispering like ghosts. Finally, Reese sighed again and placed his hat back on. You always did have your own way of doing things. I'll give you a few days, but after that, if Bragg presses the charge, I'll have to come back. Caleb nodded once. Then tell him to come quick. As the sheriff rode off, Evelyn appeared on the porch, pale and frightened. What did he say? She asked when Caleb returned. He looked up at her, the light catching the scars on his cheek. He said your husband's looking for you. Her hands trembled. Then we have to leave. He'll kill us both. Caleb shook his head. You're not running anymore. Not while you're under my roof. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. Why? You don't even know us. He paused at the door, his voice steady. Final. Because I've seen too many good people suffer while cowards walk free. Not this time. That night, the ranch was silent again, but not from peace, only from the weight of what was coming. Caleb sat by the window, rifle across his knees, watching the horizon where darkness gathered. He'd promised they'd be safe, and a man like Caleb Thorne never broke his word, no matter what it cost him. The days after the sheriff's visit passed in uneasy quiet. The air on the ranch was heavy with the scent of coming rain, and though the sky remained pale and clear, a tension brewed beneath it, like thunder waiting to break. Evelyn Bragg moved slowly but steadily now. The bruises along her arms had begun to fade from deep violet to soft yellow, and her ribs, though still tender, no longer made her cry out with every breath. She spent her mornings sitting on the porch wrapped in a shawl, mending torn shirts or shelling beans while she watched Lydia chase the chickens. The little girl's laughter drifted through the yard like sunlight, light and free, something the ranch hadn't heard in years. Caleb Thorne, as always, worked silently from dawn to dusk. He fixed fences, hauled feed, and mended the old barn door. But something had changed in the rhythm of his days. He found himself glancing toward the house more often than before, listening for that small voice or the faint sound of Evelyn humming as she worked. It unsettled him, how easily two strangers had filled the silence he'd once thought he needed. One afternoon, as he stacked hay in the barn, Lydia appeared in the doorway, her tiny hands clutching a wildflower. She had plucked it from the field, the stem bent and muddy, but her smile was pure pride. "Mr. Thorne?" she said. "Mama says angels protect people. I think you're one." Caleb paused mid-motion. The words struck deeper than the girl could ever understand. An angel. He almost laughed. He, a man who'd spent years hiding from the world, from his own ghosts. But when he turned to look at her, something inside him softened. He knelt, the hay rustling beneath his boots. "I ain't no angel, little one," he said gently. "Just a man who's got more time than sense." Lydia frowned, thinking that over. "Well, maybe angels don't know they're angels," she said brightly. He couldn't argue with that. That evening, as the sun bled orange across the sky, Evelyn limped into the barn, holding a bowl of stew. "You've been out here all day," she said. "You should eat while it's warm." He set down his tools and accepted the bowl, careful not to meet her eyes too long. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," she said. "It's the least I can do." They ate in quiet, the only sound the horses shifting in their stalls. After a while, Evelyn spoke again. "You remind me of my father," she said softly. He didn't talk much either, but when he did, people listened. He used to say the hardest hearts sometimes hide the kindest ones. Caleb stirred the stew with his spoon, unsure how to reply. Compliments made him uncomfortable, they always had, but her words warmed something buried deep inside him. When she turned to leave, she swayed slightly, clutching her side. He reached out, steadying her without thinking. Her hand rested against his arm, and for a brief moment, the air between them changed. Not romantic, just human. Two wounded souls recognizing the same kind of pain in each other. "You'll be all right," he said quietly. Evelyn nodded, maybe for the first time in a long while. That night, after Lydia fell asleep beside the hearth, Evelyn lingered at the window, watching the dark stretch over the valley. Caleb sat outside on the porch, pipe in hand, staring out at the horizon. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost, but about what he still had a chance to protect. Inside, Evelyn whispered to herself, maybe kindness isn't gone from the world after all. And outside, Caleb Thorne looked up at the stars and thought, perhaps, for the first time in his life, that he wasn't meant to live alone forever. The peace that had slowly settled over Thorne Ranch shattered one dry afternoon in late summer. The sky had turned the color of brass, and the wind carried the scent of dust and coming storm. Caleb was mending a corral fence when the dogs began to bark. First one, then both, their deep, throaty growls echoing across the yard. He straightened, squinting toward the dirt road that led to the main gate. In the shimmering heat, 3 figures rode fast across the plain, men on horseback, kicking up a long plume of dust behind them. The moment Caleb saw the lead rider, his stomach tightened. The man sat tall in the saddle, shoulders broad, his hat pulled low, but even at a distance Caleb could see the way the horses shied under his rough hands. Tom Bragg. Inside the cabin, Evelyn froze at the sound of the barking dogs. Her needle slipped from her fingers, clattering against the floor. "He's found us," she whispered, her face draining of color. Lydia, who had been drawing by the hearth, looked up in confusion. "Mama?" "Go to the back room," Evelyn said quickly, pushing her daughter toward the door. "Hide, sweetheart, and don't come out until I say so." Outside, the riders drew up in front of the porch, dust swirling around their boots. Bragg swung down from his horse and spat in the dirt. His eyes, small and mean beneath his hat, scanned the yard. "Evelyn," he shouted, his voice coarse as gravel. "You can quit your hiding!" "I know you're here." Caleb stepped forward from the barn, slow and deliberate, his shadow long in the afternoon light. The dog snarled beside him. He said nothing, just stared, one mountain of a man facing down 3. Bragg smirked. "You must be the good Samaritan I've been hearing about," he drawled. "Appreciate you keeping my wife warm for me." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "You best watch your mouth." Bragg took a step closer. "That woman's mine." She took what wasn't hers, money, my daughter, and ran. "I'm here to collect what belongs to me." Caleb's voice came low, steady, and dangerous. "All I see is a man who beat his wife half to death. You're not taking her anywhere." The air went still. The only sound was the slow creak of saddle leather as Bragg's 2 men shifted uneasily behind him. They weren't ready for what they saw in Caleb's face, something cold, unflinching, ancient. Bragg sneered, "You gonna stop me, big man?" Caleb didn't move. "Try me." Bragg's hand twitched toward the pistol on his hip. Caleb saw it before it cleared the holster. In one swift motion, he stepped forward, grabbed the man by the wrist, and twisted. The gun clattered to the ground. Caleb's fist came down like a hammer, catching Bragg across the jaw and sending him sprawling into the dirt. The 2 other men reached for their guns, but one look from Caleb froze them. "Pick him up," he ordered. "And tell him, next time he comes here, he won't walk away." Bragg groaned, blood running from his split lip. "You'll regret this," he spat. "The law's on my side." Caleb leaned down, voice low and deadly calm. "Then the law can dig your grave when it's done." The men dragged Bragg back to his horse, muttering curses as they rode off toward the horizon. Dust hung in the air long after they disappeared. When Caleb turned back toward the house, he saw Evelyn standing on the porch, tears streaming down her face. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice trembling. "He won't stop now." Caleb holstered his rifle and looked her square in the eyes. "I don't care if he stops. I care that he knows there's one place on this earth he can't touch you again." From the doorway, Lydia peeked out, clutching her mother's skirt. Evelyn pulled her close, her heart pounding with equal parts fear and gratitude. Above them, thunder rolled over the valley like a warning. The storm was coming, for all of them, but this time, Caleb Thorne was ready to face it head-on. The storm that had threatened for days finally broke. Thunder rolled across the plains like distant cannon fire, and lightning flashed over the ridge, throwing jagged light across Thorne Ranch. Inside the house, the lamps flickered as the wind battered the windows. Evelyn sat near the hearth, her daughter Lydia curled beside her, clutching a worn doll. Every crash of thunder made the little girl flinch. Caleb Thorne stood by the window, shotgun propped beside him. He hadn't said much since Bragg's visit, but his silence was no longer the quiet of a man avoiding the world. It was the stillness before battle. He knew Tom Bragg wasn't the kind to accept humiliation. Men like him didn't just ride away and forget. They waited, plotted, and came back meaner than before. And that night, Bragg came back. It was near midnight when the dogs began to bark again, low, frantic, warning growls that cut through the sound of rain. Caleb moved to the door and peered into the dark. Through the sheets of rain, he saw the glint of lanterns. 3, maybe 4 riders moving quietly up the path. He turned to Evelyn. "Take Lydia. Go to the root cellar and stay down there till I call." "Caleb, now!" There was no arguing with that tone. Evelyn grabbed her daughter and hurried through the kitchen, lifting the trapdoor and descending into the earth's cold belly. The moment it shut above them, the house felt emptier, quieter, and far more dangerous. Caleb loaded the shotgun, the click of metal sharp and clean in the hush between thunderclaps. Then he stepped out into the rain. The riders had reached the yard, their horses restless and slick with mud. Bragg dismounted first, soaked to the bone but grinning through his busted lip. "Thought I told you the law was on my side," he shouted over the storm. "Turns out the sheriff don't take kindly to a rancher hiding another man's wife." Caleb's voice was calm. "She ain't yours. Not anymore." Bragg spat rainwater. "You think you can play hero? That woman's my property." Caleb took a slow step forward, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Ain't no man owns another soul. You lost her the moment you raised your hand against her." The other rider shifted nervously. The night crackled with more than lightning. It was tension so thick it hummed. Bragg drew his pistol, the flash of steel bright against the dark. Caleb didn't hesitate. The shotgun roared, the sound splitting the storm in two. The blast hit Bragg's arm, spinning him backward into the mud. His pistol flew from his hand and vanished into the rain. The other men froze. For a long heartbeat, no one moved. Then Caleb leveled the gun again. "Pick him up and get off my land," he said, his voice deep as thunder. "If he steps 1 foot back here, I won't aim for the arm next time." Bragg groaned, clutching his bleeding arm, his face twisted in hate and disbelief. "You'll hang for this," he rasped. Caleb stepped closer until they were nearly face to face. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But at least I'll hang knowing she and that little girl will live free." The men dragged Bragg back to his horse, and with curses lost to the storm, they rode off into the dark. For a long time after, Caleb stood in the rain, the shotgun hanging limp in his hands, water dripping from his coat. The thunder faded and silence reclaimed the valley. When he finally went back inside, Evelyn and Lydia were waiting at the trap door, eyes wide and fearful. "It's over," he said simply. Evelyn ran to him, tears and rain mixing on her cheeks. "You could have been killed." He gave a tired smile. "Would have been worth it." She touched his hand, rough, cold, trembling slightly, and whispered, "You didn't just save us, Caleb. You gave us our lives back." Outside, the storm finally broke apart, and the first pale streaks of dawn touched the horizon. The darkness was gone, and for the first time so was fear. Morning came gray and cold. The storm had passed, but the ground was soaked and heavy, every hoofprint and boot mark filled with muddy water. The smell of wet earth mixed with the sharp tang of gunpowder still lingering in the air. On the porch, Caleb Thorne sat with his shotgun across his knees. Hat pulled low, eyes fixed on the distant road. Inside, Evelyn Bragg tended to the fire while Lydia slept wrapped in a quilt, her small hand resting against her mother's arm. The little girl had cried herself to sleep after the gunfire. Evelyn hadn't slept at all. Every sound of wind against the window made her heart jolt, afraid it might be Bragg returning again. By mid-morning, the sound of hooves broke the uneasy silence. Caleb rose, his shoulders tightening as he saw a single rider approaching, a tall man in a duster coat. The sheriff. Sheriff Amos Dillard had been the law in that county for nearly 20 years, a man known for his fairness, though not for mercy. He reined in his horse near the porch and dismounted with a grunt. "Morning, Thorne," he said, voice steady but cautious. "Heard there was trouble out this way last night." Caleb nodded slowly. "You could say that." Dillard's eyes swept the yard, noting the churned mud and the faint trail of blood leading toward the road. "Tom Bragg rode into town before dawn. Said you shot him on his own land while he was trying to bring home his wife and child." Caleb's jaw tightened. "That man near beat her to death, Sheriff. He came here twice to drag her back. I warned him what had happened if he tried again." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "And you followed through?" "I did." Dillard sighed, removing his hat. "You know I can't just let this slide, Caleb. Bragg's screaming for justice, says he'll press charges." Evelyn stepped out onto the porch then, pale but steady. "Sheriff, if you take this man in, you might as well take me, too. He saved my life, and my daughter's. Tom would have killed me." Dillard turned to her, his face softening. "Mrs. Bragg, I don't doubt what that man did to you. Folks in town have seen your bruises, but you understand how this looks, don't you? Bragg's got friends, and he's loud," Caleb spoke quietly. "Let him be loud. Truth don't need shouting." The sheriff looked between them, the morning wind tugging at his coat. He'd known Caleb Thorne for years, knew he was a man who avoided trouble, not one who sought it. Still, law was law, and the county didn't tolerate vigilantes. "Bragg's arm's shattered," Dillard said finally. "Doctor says he's lucky you didn't aim higher." "I wasn't trying to kill him," Caleb said. "Just stop him," the sheriff nodded slowly. "And you did. He won't be swinging a whip for a while." A long silence passed. The only sound was the creak of the porch boards beneath Caleb's boots. Then the sheriff spoke again, voice low. "I'm going to write this up as self-defense. But you listen close, Thorne. If that man dies or disappears, I'll have to come back. And if you're smart, you'll keep this woman and her girl close for a while. Bragg's got spite in him, and spite's worse than bullets." Caleb gave a small nod. "Appreciate that, Amos." The sheriff tipped his hat, turned to Evelyn, and said softly, "Ma'am, you've got a safe place here. You stay put. Don't go near town till this settles." Then he mounted up and rode off, leaving the sound of hooves fading into the wet horizon. Evelyn looked at Caleb, her eyes glistening. "You could have lied." "Said nothing happened." He shook his head. "Man's word means something, even when it costs." She nodded, tears spilling over. "You've lost a lot, haven't you?" "Enough to know some things are worth the loss," he said quietly. As the clouds broke and sunlight began to touch the fields, Evelyn realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid anymore. Not because danger was gone, but because someone had finally stood up for her and meant it. Autumn crept slowly across the plains. The grass turned from green to gold, and the mornings came with a sharp chill that hinted at winter's approach. The sky stretched endlessly blue above Thorne Ranch, and for the first time in months, peace seemed to settle over the valley like a long-awaited blessing. Evelyn Bragg had begun to walk without wincing now. The bruises were gone, replaced by a quiet strength in her step. Each day she found small ways to repay what she felt she owed. Cooking meals, tending to the chickens, mending clothes. But the truth was, Caleb Thorne never asked her to repay a thing. He worked the land as he always had, steady and silent, yet there was something different in him now. His solitude no longer felt like a wall. Sometimes, when the day's work was done, he'd sit on the porch beside Evelyn while Lydia played in the dirt, building pretend corrals with twigs. They didn't need to speak much. The quiet between them was no longer heavy. It was gentle, understood. One evening, the sunset painted the world in gold and rose. Lydia ran toward the horizon chasing a grasshopper, her laughter echoing across the field. Evelyn watched her, a soft smile touching her lips. "She hasn't laughed like that in years," she murmured. Caleb looked out at the child, then back at Evelyn. "Kids don't forget kindness. Even when they've seen hurt," Evelyn turned to him. "She talks about you all the time, you know. Says the giant cowboy keeps the monsters away." He chuckled low. "I've fought a few in my time, but none so stubborn as the ones inside a man's own head." She studied him for a moment. "You mean the kind that tell you you're meant to be alone?" He didn't answer, but his eyes softened. The wind tugged gently at the brim of his hat. Days passed, and life on the ranch fell into rhythm. Caleb took Lydia riding on the old mare, teaching her how to hold the reins, how to listen to the animal beneath her. Evelyn began baking again, filling the house with the smell of bread and cinnamon. The place that once felt like a shelter now felt like a home, but the past was not forgotten. News came weeks later that Tom Bragg had left the county, his arm crippled, his pride in ruins. Some said he'd gone south to find work in the mines. Others whispered he drank himself into the desert. Whatever the truth, he never came back. And slowly, the shadow he'd cast began to lift. One crisp morning, as frost glittered on the fence posts, Caleb hitched the wagon for a supply run to town. Evelyn stood at the doorway, shawl wrapped tight. "You sure it's safe for you to go alone?" she asked. He gave her a faint smile. "Sheriff says folks have stopped talking. Guess time dulls even a scandal." Before he climbed up, Lydia ran to him, clutching a small bundle, a hand-drawn picture of the three of them. A tall man, a woman, and a little girl holding hands beneath a big sun. "So you don't forget us," she said. Caleb looked at the drawing for a long time before tucking it into his coat pocket. "I don't reckon I could if I tried," he said softly. That evening, when he returned, the sky was full of stars. Evelyn was waiting on the porch, lantern glowing in her hand. "You came back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Didn't have much reason not to." For a long moment, they stood there, two people who had known loss, pain, and the long silence of loneliness. And yet in that stillness, something unspoken passed between them. Not romance, not quite yet, but the fragile beginning of trust. Evelyn smiled. "Supper's on the table." Caleb looked toward the window, where the warm light glowed and Lydia's shadow moved behind the curtain. He took a breath of the cool night air and stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Outside, the wind carried the faint smell of rain and earth, whispering across the fields. The Thorn Ranch, once a place of ghosts and silence, now held the sound of life again. And for Caleb Thorne, Evelyn, and little Lydia, morning would never look quite the same again.